This is Larry Rosenthal of the Goldman School with Step 3 of the Eightfold Path, Construct the Alternatives, some tips. We'll have some observations about this step of the Eightfold Path, and then we'll turn towards some things to consider doing, and lastly, we'll talk about some things you probably should avoid. First, some observations. Alternatives in Bardak's terms are solutions. These are steps which, if implemented, will reduce the scope and/or severity of a problem. There's a means-ends logic there. We mean you to hone in at this stage on the ideas you think just might work. As you do so, considering your alternatives may help you refine your problem definition if you wish to revise it slightly through the process that Bardak calls iteration. Of course, that's appropriate at this stage. Lastly, an observation that you've defined the problem, you've assembled some evidence. It may be time to build a model. Modeling what causes the problem, what relieves it, what makes it worse, will help reveal possible alternatives, and we'll look at an example of that process in just a moment. A list of some things to consider doing. First, start with too many options, the kitchen sink approach. Be exhaustive, be open-ended. Write down ideas that may not succeed politically, that may be too expensive. Ignore all that for now. If you can think of the idea and you think it might work towards relieving the policy problem, write it down. Next, as you do so, list basic alternatives and variants. And in fact, you can build some of these on features of existing programs, features you may wish to modify or eliminate. For example, if you look at the problem statement, too many harmful side effects from pharmaceutical medicines, you'll think carefully about existing drug regulation, and you'll look at ways in which slight variations on existing policy may be the right way to go. Next, always include on your list of alternatives, do nothing for now, also known as let present trends continue. We always imagine the possibility that none of our alternatives that we analyze will prevail over the status quo, and we want to make sure to include doing nothing as a responsible alternative on our list. We'll work from Bardak's Things Governments Do list in Appendix B. This is a resource list that we can use to develop all our alternatives, and we'll talk about it in greater detail in our next unit. Lastly, for this set of tips, remember that criteria, the standards for evaluating these alternatives, will get their own spotlight. In fact, the next step of the Eightfold Path is selecting those criteria. Let's not hamstring this process of constructing alternatives by prematurely asking about how expensive they may be or how feasible they may be. Let's write them all down and save criteria for their own stage in the process. Let's look closely at this idea of modeling. When you make a model, you create a schematic diagram of a problem's causes to find intervention points. Let's use this example problem, too many harmful side effects from pharmaceutical medicines. An example model may look like this. We have a drug testing and approval process that brings these drugs towards physicians who develop practices in prescribing them, and then drug advertising may also take place at that stage. And lastly, the patients who are prescribed these drugs may have behavioral responses and will experience some side effects, harmful or otherwise. And in this process, this causal chain, we may identify specific moments in the production of our public policy problem that we would focus on for alternatives. For example, in the drug testing and approval process, we may consider that the side effects are not detected frequently enough or accurately enough, and we would want to have alternatives that look at revising the drug testing process. Turning towards the tips on some things to avoid doing when constructing the alternatives. First, do not ignore interactions among alternatives. Rarely are all your ideas mutually exclusive, nor should they be at this stage. Be mindful that some of these alternatives will be slight variants of others, and if you see these interactions, you may have opportunities to create combinations or hybrids later, or look at ways in which these ideas could be phased for implementation. Don't ignore those interactions. Next, just like we said at the problem definition stage, do not be blinded by your prior conceptions. Be open-minded. We'll have plenty of opportunity to identify the impacts of alternatives, to apply our criteria to the outcomes that we predict, and we want to make sure that we are as open-minded as we have been previously in the Eightfold Path. Next, don't forget the scoping decisions you made in your problem definition. You may revise that problem definition in a very minor or gradual way as you go, but if you've made big decisions about what's included and what's excluded, make sure to remember those decisions because it will help to resolve the list of alternatives and figure out what belongs and what doesn't. Lastly, don't be too quick to dispense with options seemingly too expensive or inconvenient. Expense, convenience, feasibility, political acceptability, these are criteria. We'll get to those at the next step. Reviewing, we've talked about constructing the alternatives and provided some tips. We've provided some observations and then some things to consider doing and some things to consider avoiding doing. That's it for this lecture. We'll move on to the next unit.